Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We're going to talk about Critical Role, and we're going to talk about and I'm going to respond to a video I watched recently that said that was an editorial on declaring that the D&D commentator thought that Critical Role would launch their own tabletop role-playing game. All right? So I am going to 100% debunk that and tell you why Critical Role will not launch their own tabletop role-playing game competing with Dungeons & Dragons. I firmly disagree with this, Dungeons & Dragons commentator who declared that he thinks Critical Role will actually launch their own competing tabletop role-playing game. This is a hot topic. I actually love this topic. So basically, you got D&D now, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. You got D&D then, D&D 1E to D&D 4E, and you got D&D Not, which are copies of D&D 1E to 4E, right, that are not D&D, right? So the D&D then and the D&D then and the D&D Not, they love this idea of Critical Role competing against Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition sits proudly at the top of the tabletop role-playing game industry, virtually unchallenged, right? Like it is destroying the rest of the industry. It crushes it, right? And actually, it seems to have only gotten a significant multiplier since March 2020 happened, right? It's just Dungeons & Dragons dominance seems to have been increased since March 2020, right? It's just a fact, right? So there are a lot of people in the D&D then camp and the D&D not camp that really want to see Critical Role throw down the gauntlet and say, here's a tabletop role-playing game that will defeat Dungeons & Dragons, right? And D&D, a lot of D&D then, because they're sour about D&D 5th edition's absolute, powerful, unmitigated, unquestioned dominance of the tabletop role-playing game industry, and D&D Not's complete inability to catch up or put anything on the board that matters or that people pay attention to. So basically, you have these teams who really want to see Critical Role champion. They don't even care. They don't even like Critical Role. They just want to see D&D 5e fall, right? And so there's these fans that want Critical Role to put up some points, right? To actually to create a tabletop role-playing game that will compete. So I'm going to tell you why. So there was some good evidence in this other D&D commentator's video, and he said, they've made their own publishing company, and Matthew Mercer hasn't been on any live casts for Dungeons & Dragons in a while. And I think those are the two main things in there. And that's because they're positioning to launch their own their own tabletop role-playing game to compete with Dungeons & Dragons, right? And it's going to win, right? And they're out. And actually, I'm not even sure if they said it was going to win. They said they'll do it. So I'm going to make my prediction right now. I'll tell you right now. I predict that in 2022 and 2023, Critical Role will not create any any tabletop role-playing game which will be a medieval European or close bog standard American fantasy tabletop role-playing game that is designed to compete with Dungeons & Dragons. And the reason why is a few things. Okay, so here I'll tell you the reasons why. So first of all, Matthew Mercer doesn't like to fail, and this isn't a small thing, right? Like a lot of you're like, well, who wants to fail? A lot of people want to fail, and a lot of, in tech, right? Like, fail fast is literally a saying. Like, you get in, you take your lumps, you fail, then you fix it, and then you go forward, right? And that is not Matthew Mercer's model. He doesn't take a lot of risks. He does incredibly safe things. They were on Pathfinder, right? In the beginning of that's, by the way, Pathfinder is where Critical Role started, right? And they were like, oh, well, we can get a lot more fans and a lot more people viewing this if we just switch to D&D 5e, right? And they were right? And so when they switched over to D&D 5e, so here's the thing: you can't really beat D&D 5e, right? And there's some strong. I'm going to give you some powerful evidence of this. First of all, the strongest evidence that you cannot compete with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition without massive risk, which Matthew Mercer has zero stomach for, right? Matthew Mercer, everything he does is very, very safe, right? Like, he's not high risk. He doesn't have a tolerance for risk, okay? He does essentially a show with D&D 5e, the safest game you could do that show with. And the other thing is, I really think he could really transform Critical Role and really make it powerful and great if he quit his voice acting job. He doesn't, because it's safe money, right? He does not take significant risks. He bunts. He never swings, right? And that's the thing. If you're going to go for Dungeons & Dragons, you're going to come for the king, you best not miss, right? And Mercer is smart, and he knows D&D 5e will wreck him. Any attempt he makes, right? And so first of all, he can't be all in. He can't actually do it. So here's a few things. So one, Critical Role is Mercer. I am shocked how little everybody else around him does, right? They don't even, look at the characters they're running for this third edition. They're not even real characters, right? His players don't even take the time to read the 5th edition books and find viable races and viable classes. They're like, hey, Matt, why don't you continue to do all the heavy lifting? Why don't you continue to Michael Jordan and we'll Scottie Pippen you, right? And you could carry us on your back the way you've done from the beginning, right? They don't even make characters that they have no willingness to learn even the viable options for their characters, let alone how to play them, right? And so Matthew Mercer's got to do the whole thing on his own, but he can't. He can't create a competitor to Dungeons & Dragons because he has to carry all of Critical Role, and he will not quit his day job, which means he literally doesn't have the time, okay? Here's the biggest kicker, right? I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Game of Thrones. That thing was on for 8 years. It had 2 different companies that owned the license. You know what that tabletop role-playing game did? Jack all of nothing. No one cared, right? That thing had $100 million a year, maybe like $200 million a year series on television, right? And couldn't even come close to denting fractions of D&D 5e sales, right? So the reality is Matthew Mercer does not have any actual help, right? He does not actually have any tolerance for the risk it would take. Like, the other thing is, if he borrowed $10 or $20 million and really went to town and got some really good staff, maybe bought the help he needs, right? He could do it, but he doesn't have the stomach for risk. Matthew Mercer doesn't have help. He doesn't have the stomach for risk. He quite literally doesn't have the time because he won't quit his day job, right? Everything he's doing, he's half in. He's 1 foot in. He's 1 foot in on his voice acting. He's 1 foot in on Critical Role. He won't commit, and he can't get it done. Period. Right? And I think that the Game of Thrones tabletop role-playing game that was with North Star Games and was with FFG was not even able to dent Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition with any real sales, right? If you can't do it with a $200 million show on television carrying the banner for your game, how on earth are you going to create something that's actually going to compete with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? And the reality is, you ain't, right? Now, I want to back it up a bit. I actually like Matthew Mercer. I think he does a tremendous job. There's no better champion for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition on the planet than Matthew Mercer. I really like him, but I really do feel like he fails because he won't get all the way in, right? He won't let one thing die in order to grow something new. And I honestly, I'm going to say it, I think a long time ago he should have dumped this, voice acting thing. He's a king, a king among people in the tabletop role-playing game, and he never accepted the crown, right? He's like, oh, I really want my voice acting's important. You can't do it all, buddy. You can't do it all. And the reality is, I think he really could have been something and taken something to the next level. But instead, he just doesn't have the willingness to commit. It's his life. He has to make his decisions. I get it, right? I understand. Of course, he's got more stake than I do in it. For me, it's an abstract concept. For him, it's very real. But the reality is, I think, the reality is he fails because he's not willing to get all the way in. And that's why I think Critical Role in 2022 and in 2023 will make no competitor attempt against Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, because Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition would take the sad sacked attempt that Matthew Mercer was able to put out between his voice acting and between his Critical Role, with no help from any of the people he's gotten to do anything really great or important, and Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition would just shred it, and he knows it. And I think that's why we're where we're at. Oh, that's my opinion. Do you agree with that other D&D commentator who did the editorial, said that Critical Role will launch? Or do you agree with me that in 2022 and in 2023, Critical Role will not launch anything? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.